It was a quiet night at Oakwood Hospital, and everything seemed calm. The nurses were finishing their rounds, and the doctors were settling into their offices for a well-deserved break. But then, a strange thing happened. A patient was brought in at midnight, and no one knew where she had come from. Her name was Lucy, but no one had any information about her. No family members showed up, and there were no medical records for her. The only thing the hospital staff knew was that she was severely injured, with strange, unexplained marks all over her body. The nurse on duty, Carla, couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. She had worked at Oakwood for years, and she had seen her fair share of strange cases, but this one was different. Lucy's eyes were wide open, staring at nothing, and her breathing was shallow. As Carla checked the patient's vitals, she noticed something strange. Her pulse was unusually high, yet she was completely still. It didn't make sense. Lucy's skin was ice cold, and when Carla touched her hand, it felt like it was frozen. Just as Carla was about to call for a doctor, Lucy suddenly sat up in bed, her eyes wide open but unblinking. Carla jumped back, startled. Lucy's mouth moved, but no sound came out. Then, without warning, she started gasping for air, as if she was drowning. Carla rushed to help, but the moment she touched Lucy's shoulder, the patient's eyes rolled back into her head. A loud, echoing bang sounded from the hallway, and the lights flickered. The entire hospital seemed to shudder. The room became unnervingly quiet. Lucy's body went limp, and Carla quickly called for a doctor. When they arrived, they found that Lucy's condition had completely changed. She was no longer gasping for air or in distress. She was just staring. But the strange thing was, no one could figure out what had happened to her. The doctors ran test after test, but there were no answers. It was as if she had come from another world entirely. And as the night wore on, more strange things began to happen. In the hours that followed, the staff began to notice odd occurrences around the hospital. The temperature would drop in certain rooms, and strange whispers echoed through the hallways, even though no one was there. Some staff members even reported seeing a shadowy figure moving just out of sight, but no one dared to speak up about it. The hospital was old, and strange things were always happening, right? But this felt different. Carla couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Something dark was lurking within Oakwood Hospital. Chapter 2. The doctor's secret. The next day, Dr. Harris, a well-respected physician at Oakwood, was asked to check on Lucy. He was a seasoned doctor, known for his calm demeanor and ability to solve the toughest cases. But even he couldn't explain what had happened to Lucy. As he entered Lucy's room, he was greeted by the same cold air that had plagued the room the night before. He was used to strange things happening in hospitals, but this was different. He had never seen anything like it. Lucy was still lying in bed, her eyes wide open, but her body seemed motionless. Dr. Harris checked her vitals, and again, they were strangely abnormal. Her pulse was low, but her body temperature was still freezing cold. "Miss Lucy," Dr. Harris said softly, but there was no response. He leaned closer, checking her eyes for any signs of movement, but there was nothing. Dr. Harris stepped back and rubbed his forehead. He had been in the medical field for years, but this was a case he couldn't explain. He began reviewing Lucy's bed, her eyes wide open, unblinking, staring at the ceiling. She wasn't making any sounds, but there was an odd sense of presence in the room, as though she wasn't alone. Dr. Harris approached the bed cautiously. As he stood beside her, he noticed something strange. There was an old photograph on the bedside table, one he didn't recognize. It was a picture of Lucy as a young girl, standing in front of a house that didn't look like any house around the area. The photo looked old, the edges frayed and yellowed with age. Where did this come from? Dr. Harris muttered to himself, confused. He hadn't seen this photo in the hospital before. Lucy's eyes suddenly shifted, focusing on the photograph. Her mouth twitched, and for the first time since she had been admitted, she whispered, "That house. It's where I died." Dr. Harris froze, his heart pounding. "What are you talking about?" he asked, leaning closer to hear her better. Lucy's voice was faint, almost inaudible. "The fire. It took me. I was burned." Her words trailed off, and her eyes locked onto Dr. Harris's. "You have to save them. The ones I left behind." The room was silent for a moment. Dr. Harris stood still, unsure what to make of what Lucy had said. Could she be talking about some kind of trauma from her past, something that had caused her mind to break? Or was there something more to it? Something supernatural? Suddenly, the lights in the room flickered again, and a cold gust of wind blew through the room, despite the windows being closed. The door slammed shut on its own, making Dr. Harris jump back. He quickly tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. He looked back at Lucy, who was still staring at him. Her face seemed pale and gaunt, and her one still hands were now shaking. She gasped, her chest heaving as if she was trying to scream, but no sound came out. Dr. Harris panicked. "Lucy, what's happening to you?" In an instant, the room seemed to get colder, the temperature dropping rapidly. Dr. Harris could see his own breath. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to grow darker, and the air felt thick, like something was pressing in on him. Without warning, Lucy's eyes rolled back into her head again. Her body went rigid, and for a brief moment, Dr. Harris thought she might be dead. But then, her body began to twitch violently, her back arching off the bed as if something inside her was trying to break free. Dr. Harris backed away, his heart racing. He quickly reached for his phone to call for help, but when he looked back at Lucy, she was calm again. Her body lay still, as if nothing had happened. But Dr. Harris couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. As he stood there, staring at the patient, he heard a faint whisper, like a voice in his ear. "They're coming for you too." The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. Dr. Harris turned, but no one was there. The room was as quiet as ever, except for the steady sound of Lucy's breathing. What had she meant by, "They're coming for you"? And what did it all have to do with that old photograph? Dr. Harris didn't know it yet, but the hospital's secrets were far darker than he could have ever imagined. Chapter 3. The woman in the mirror weeks had passed since Dr. Harris's unsettling encounter with Lucy, and the strange occurrences at Oakwood Hospital had only gotten worse. The staff tried to carry on with their work, but many of them couldn't shake the eerie feeling that the hospital was hiding something. Nurse Emily, who had worked at Oakwood for nearly a decade, was no exception. She had seen her fair share of strange things, but this was different. One night, after her shift ended, Emily was walking down the hall to the break room when she noticed something odd in the hallway. The hospital was usually quiet at night, but tonight, there was an unsettling feeling in the air. The lights in the hallway flickered as she walked past, casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. As Emily passed a large mirror that hung on the wall in the hallway, she caught a glimpse of something strange, something that made her stop dead in her tracks. In the reflection of the mirror, she saw a woman standing at the end of the hallway. The woman had long, dark hair that hung loosely around her face, and her clothes were old-fashioned, like something from the past. She looked pale, almost ghostly. Emily blinked and turned to look, but when she turned back to the mirror, the woman was gone. Her heart pounded in her chest. "What was that?" she muttered under her breath. The hallway was empty. There was no one there. Shaking her head, Emily continued toward the break room, trying to convince herself that it was just her imagination playing tricks on her. But as she walked, she couldn't help but feel like someone or something was watching her. When she entered the break room, she found a few other nurses sitting at the table. They were talking quietly, but when Emily walked in, they all stopped and looked at her with wide eyes. "Emily, are you okay?" one of them asked. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Emily hesitated for a moment before speaking. "I just saw something strange in the hallway. A woman in the mirror. She was standing there, but when I looked again, she was gone." The other nurses exchanged uneasy glances, and one of them spoke up. "That's not the first time someone's seen her." Emily frowned. "What do you mean?" The nurse lowered her voice. "There have been stories around here for years. People seeing a woman in the mirror, or hearing her whispers. They say she was a patient who died here a long time ago, but no one really knows the full story. All we know is, she doesn't seem to leave." The room fell silent. Emily's blood ran cold. She had always heard rumors about Oakwood Hospital being haunted, but she had never paid them much attention. Now, though, after seeing the woman herself, she wasn't so sure anymore. What if the hospital really was hiding something? What if Lucy's strange condition and the sightings of the woman in the mirror were connected? Emily knew she had to find out the truth, but little did she know, the answer she sought would lead her down a path she could never have imagined. Chapter 4. The dark room. Emily's curiosity about the woman in the mirror grew stronger with each passing day. She couldn't shake the image of the pale woman with dark hair, and she couldn't stop thinking about the strange stories the other nurses had shared. One night, unable to sleep, Emily decided to go back to the hallway where she had seen the woman. She needed answers. She needed to know what was happening at Oakwood. She waited until her shift was over and the hospital was quiet. She walked down the hall, her footsteps echoing in the empty corridors. When she reached the mirror, she stood still and stared into it, hoping for a sign. At first, nothing happened. The hallway behind her was empty, and the glass reflected only her own face. But then, as she continued to stare, something strange began to happen. The glass seemed to ripple, like the surface of water disturbed by a stone. Emily gasped and stepped back. The mirror flickered, and she saw the woman again, only this time, she wasn't standing at the end of the hall. She was right behind Emily. Emily spun around, but no one was there. The hallway was empty, just as it had been before. Her breath came in quick gasps as she turned back to the mirror. The woman was still there, her eyes now fixed on Emily. This time, she opened her mouth as if to speak. But before Emily could hear anything, the reflection of the woman vanished. leaving only a dark, empty space behind the glass. As the room grew cold, Emily's heart raced. What was happening? What had she just witnessed? And then, she heard it. Whispers, faint at first, but growing louder. The whispers seemed to come from the walls, from the very air around her. Words she couldn't understand, like a language from another time. Emily was terrified. She had to get out of there. But when she turned to leave, the lights in the hallway flickered again, and she saw something she wasn't prepared for. A shadow, dark and long, moving across the floor. It wasn't just a shadow. It was something more, something alive. And Emily realized, with a sinking feeling in her stomach, that the hospital wasn't just haunted. It was something far worse. The whispers grew louder, and the shadow grew larger. There was nowhere to run. Chapter 5. The truth revealed. Emily had always believed that hospitals were places of healing, of life-saving care. But the truth she was beginning to uncover about Oakwood Hospital was something far more sinister. She had seen the woman in the mirror. She had heard the whispers, and she knew deep down that there was something dark buried within the walls of that place. Determined to find the answers, Emily started digging into the hospital's history. She spent her free time going through old records, talking to longtime staff members, and looking for any clues that could explain what was happening. It didn't take long for her to find the first clue. An old newspaper article caught her eye. It was about a fire that had broken out at Oakwood Hospital decades ago, a fire that had claimed to beat. She remembered Dr. Harris's strange encounter with the patient named Lucy. Was it possible that this was the same woman? The pieces were starting to fit together in a way that terrified her. Emily continued to read through the article. It detailed the tragic events of the fire, the confusion that followed, and the whispers that had circulated in the hospital after it. The most chilling part of the article was a mention of a woman who had been seen wandering the halls of Oakwood shortly after the fire. Many believed she had died in the blaze, but there were others who claimed that her spirit had never left. They said that she returned every year, in the form of a shadow, a whisper, or a fleeting image in the mirror. Emily's hands trembled as she closed the article. She had to find out more. She needed to know what happened to Lucy and why her spirit seemed to linger in the hospital, haunting the living. The next day, Emily spoke to Dr. Harris. She explained everything she had discovered about the fire, about Lucy, and about the strange occurrences that had been happening at the hospital. At first, Dr. Harris seemed skeptical, but as Emily shared the details, his expression grew more serious. "I've seen things too," he admitted quietly. "I thought I was just imagining it. But now I'm not so sure. The photograph Lucy had, it wasn't just a random picture. It was from the house she lived in before the fire. That house was torn down years ago. But something tells me it's still connected to her death." Emily felt a chill run down her spine. The house, the fire, Lucy's spirit, they were all connected somehow. But how? What was the dark force that still lingered in Oakwood Hospital? And what did it want? The answers were within the hospital itself, hidden in the very rooms and halls where patients and staff had come and gone for decades. Emily and Dr. Harris made a plan to investigate further, to uncover the truth about Lucy's death, and hopefully put an end to the haunting that plagued Oakwood. That night, Emily and Dr. Harris returned to the hospital after hours. The air was thick with tension, and an eerie silence seemed to swallow them as they made their way through the empty halls. The lights flickered above them, casting long shadows across the floor. They arrived at the old records room, a place that hadn't been touched in years. Dust covered the floor, and the shelves were stacked high with old files and papers. Emily pulled out a box of old hospital records and began to sift through them, hoping to find more information about the fire. As she flipped through the papers, she came across a folder labeled Lucy Malone. Her hand shook as she opened it, revealing a stack of documents, including a report on the fire. The report detailed the events leading up to the fire, and Emily could see that it had been a tragic accident. A malfunction in the hospital's electrical system had caused a short circuit, sparking the fire that spread through the building. But as Emily read further, she found something that made her blood run cold. There, hidden in the last page of the report, was a statement from a nurse who had been on duty the night of the fire. The nurse claimed that Lucy had been seen standing by the window just before the fire started. She was staring out into the night, as if waiting for something or someone. The nurse mentioned that Lucy had seemed unusually calm, almost as if she knew the fire was coming. That was when the pieces clicked together. Lucy hadn't just died in the fire. She had been waiting for it. She had known it was coming. But why? What had happened to her in that house? What had caused her to become so tied to the hospital, to haunt its halls for decades? Emily turned to Dr. Harris, her voice barely a whisper. "We have to find the house, the one in the photo. That's where it all started." Dr. Harris nodded. "But it's gone. The house was torn down a long time ago." "We have to try," Emily insisted. "If we can find the site where the house stood, maybe we can uncover the truth. Maybe we can stop this haunting once and for all." With a heavy heart, They left the hospital and headed to the location where Lucy's house had once stood. The area was now a vacant lot, overgrown with weeds. Emily and Dr. Harris walked carefully through the lot, looking for any signs that might explain the strange occurrences at Oakwood. As they reached the center of the lot, Emily felt a sudden chill wash over her. The air felt different here, thick and heavy, as if something was waiting. And then they saw it, a small weathered stone, half buried in the earth, with an inscription that read, "Lucy Malone, gone but not forgotten." Emily's breath caught in her throat. It was a gravestone. The house might have been torn down, but Lucy's spirit remained. It had never left. She had died, but something about this place, about this spot, had anchored her soul to Oakwood Hospital. As Emily knelt down to touch the stone, the ground beneath her seemed to tremble. The air grew cold, and she could hear a faint whisper on the wind. "Help me," the voice said, soft and desperate. Suddenly, everything went dark. Emily and Dr. Harris were plunged into total blackness, as if the world around them had disappeared. A wave of panic washed over Emily. She reached out for Dr. Harris, but she couldn't feel him. The air was thick, almost suffocating. And then she heard it again, the whisper, "Help me." Emily's heart raced as she realized that Lucy's spirit was reaching out to her. She wasn't just haunting the hospital, she was begging for release. And now, it was up to Emily to set her free. But how? As the darkness swallowed them whole, Emily and Dr. Harris knew they were about to face the truth that had been hidden for decades, the truth that could finally put an end to the haunting of Oakwood Hospital.